Montana Territory. June 1883, the church doors burst open just as the preacher asked if anyone had reason to object. And that was when everything fell apart. Penelope Dearing stood frozen at the altar, her hands trembling over a bouquet of white wildflowers. The heavy silence that followed the gasps echoed louder than any gunshot. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath caught, her lips parted in disbelief. Across from her, Robert Lennox, her groom, took a step back, eyes downcast, jaw tight. "I cannot," he said, voice low, shame thick in every word. I cannot do this." And just like that, he turned and walked down the aisle alone, past friends, family, and neighbors, leaving Penelope in front of everyone abandoned in her white dress, face pale as the veil that slipped from her hair and drifted to the floor. The silence dragged on. No one moved until boots sounded against the wooden floorboards. A tall figure rose from the back pew, broad-shouldered and sun-browned from the range. His hat was in his hand, dark hair tousled and unruly from the breeze outside. He walked straight down the center aisle without hesitating. Victor Fallen. Penelope barely knew him, not really. He had ridden through town now and then, checking on his aging uncle's land west of town, helping during branding season, quiet and polite. Folks whispered things about him, that he had buried a fiancée young, that he never stayed in one place too long, that he kept to himself for a reason. She had never spoken more than a few words to him before today, but now he stood in front of her. "If he will not have you," Victor said, voice steady and clear, "I will treasure you forever." Penelope's breath caught again, but not from shame this time. Gasps fluttered through the church again, but she was only looking at him. Victor's eyes were storm dark but gentle. There was no pity there, only something quiet and rooted, like the way a man planted his feet before a hard day's work and faced it head-on. "You do not need to say anything now," he added. "I just could not watch him walk away and leave you thinking that meant you were not worth loving." Penelope blinked fast, her throat tightening. Her fingers clenched around her bouquet. Then, slowly, she stepped down from the altar and walked past the preacher, toward Victor. Outside, the sun beat down on the wooden steps of the church, and the wind pulled at the hem of her dress as Victor led her toward his horse. The crowd spilled outside behind them, hushed and stunned. "I do not know what I am doing," Penelope said, voice shaking. "I do," Victor answered, lifting her gently into the saddle before swinging up behind her. "You are coming with me." They rode out of town before anyone dared say a word. Victor's ranch, Fallen Creek, sat in a quiet bend of the river, surrounded by open prairie and far from curious eyes. By the time the sun dipped low, they were riding through the gate. A small cabin stood at the edge of a line of cottonwoods, smoke curling from the chimney. He helped her down, careful not to touch her too long, too much. "You can stay here as long as you need. I will sleep in the barn." "You do not owe me anything." She looked up at him, startled. "You said forever." He gave a slow nod. "I meant it, but I also meant that you do not have to say anything back. You have had enough taken from you today." The words settled between them, warm and solid. Her eyes burned and she turned away fast, blinking hard. The cabin was clean, simple pinewood walls, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and a bed made up with a thick quilt. She stood in the doorway, unsure. "I will bring water," Victor said, setting her trunk down. "And see to the horses." She did not speak, only nodded. But when he stepped back out into the fading light, Penelope pressed a hand to her chest and finally let the tears fall. That night was quiet. Victor returned just before dusk fully fell, handed her a bowl of stew without speaking, and sat on the porch steps to eat his own. She watched him through the window, the slow, steady movements, the way he faced the wind without blinking. After she finished, she stepped outside and sat beside him, her bare feet tucked under her skirt. "My father will be furious," she said after a long time. "Let him be," Victor said. He was not the one left at the altar. She glanced at him, then down at her hands. "You do not even know me." "I know you did not deserve that," he said. "And I know what it is to lose someone, to be left with all the pieces and no one to help you hold them." She looked at him then, really looked at him. He was younger than she had thought, maybe 29 or 30, but his eyes had seen more than his years. There was something about his steadiness, the way he did not try to fix her, just stayed close. "I am not broken," she said. "I know." She let out a breath. "But I am not whole either." He turned to her finally, meeting her eyes. "Then let me be the one to help you find the rest." Her throat tightened again. This time she did not look away. The next morning, Penelope rose early. She braided her hair and helped carry water. She gathered eggs and swept the porch. Victor never said a word, just handed her what she needed, worked beside her, and never treated her like a guest or a burden. Days passed. They found a rhythm. She cooked. He repaired the corral fence. She read aloud from an old book in the evenings while he whittled by the fire. One night, as thunder cracked in the distance, she stepped out onto the porch and found him staring at the sky. Lightning lit up the distant hills. "I used to like storms," she said softly. He looked at her. "What changed?" "I think I forgot how to feel safe." Victor took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "You are safe here." She turned slowly, met his eyes. "I believe you." He did not kiss her, not yet, but he reached out and took her hand, and she let him. They stood like that while the sky lit up with fire and rain. And for the first time in weeks, her heart beat steady again. 3 weeks later, Penelope woke to the sound of footsteps outside. When she opened the door, Victor was leading a young boy from the woods no older than 6, clothes torn, face smeared with tears and dirt. "I found him near the river," Victor said. "Looks like he has been out there alone a while." The boy clung to Victor's hand but looked at Penelope with wide, frightened eyes. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Nathan," he whispered. "They left me." Victor crouched beside him. "We will not." Penelope knelt down too, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You are safe now." Nathan sniffled but nodded. Victor looked at her, and suddenly she saw it not just kindness, not just steadiness, a heart that was ready to love again, and she knew hers was too. That night, she tucked Nathan into bed, then stepped outside to find Victor standing by the fence line watching the stars. She walked up to him, heart hammering. "You said forever," she whispered. He turned to her, startled. She reached for his hand. "I am ready to say it back now." He pulled her close, and this time he kissed her slow, deep, steady. Like everything he did when they pulled apart, she smiled through tears. "I love you, Victor Fallen." He touched her cheek. "And I love you, Penelope Dearing." The wind stirred the cottonwoods, and the stars shone bright above them. And for the first time, they both knew they had found what they never thought they would again: home. The heat broke 3 days later, and the land smelled of wet dust and new grass. Victor saddled the mule and wagon just after sunup, tying down the crates with quiet efficiency. Penelope stood at the edge of the yard, arms folded, watching him work. Nathan sat on the porch step with a piece of bread in one hand, a wooden whistle in the other, carving marks into the dirt with the toe of his boot. "I could come with you," Penelope said, not quite a question. Victor checked the harness straps again. "You could," he said. "But we'll be stopping at the feed store first. Folks'll talk." "I've lived through worse than talk." He met her eyes then, something measuring in his gaze. "I know you have." Nathan looked up from the steps. "Can I go too?" Victor hesitated for the first time that morning. Penelope crouched beside the boy. "We'll both go. It's time folks see us together. All of us." Victor gave one short nod and handed her the reins. The road into town ran straight and rutted, bordered by fence lines and blue flax blooming along shallow gullies. Penelope kept Nathan close beside her on the bench seat. Victor walked ahead with the horse, letting them talk without listening in. "Do you remember anything else about where you came from?" she asked gently. Nathan looked down at his hands. "There was a red barn and a big dog. But I don't think they're coming back." She didn't press further. Instead, she reached for the tin pail under the seat and offered him a slice of dried apple. He took it without a word and leaned against her side, small and warm and quiet. By the time they reached town, the sun was high and the street busy. The wagon creaked past the blacksmith's, the mercantile, the schoolhouse with its bell rope swinging in the breeze. Penelope kept her shoulders straight, her chin high. People turned to watch them pass. A few whispered. Some looked away. Others stared openly. She didn't flinch. Victor stopped the wagon in front of the feed store and tied off the mule. "I'll only be a few minutes." "I'll take Nathan to look at the books," she said, nodding toward the shop next door. Victor paused. "You sure?" She gave a faint, determined smile. "I'm not hiding anymore." The bookshop was cool inside, the windows shaded by canvas awnings. Dust motes drifted in the sunbeams and the scent of ink and leather filled the air. Nathan darted toward the back, drawn by a row of picture books. The shopkeeper, a narrow-shouldered man with spectacles and a tidy beard, watched her from behind the counter. "Miss Dearing, or is it Mrs. Fallen now?" She held his gaze. "I haven't changed my name yet, but you will." She didn't look away. "Yes," he nodded, as if filing the answer away beside the ledgers and invoices. "Then you're welcome here," she exhaled slowly. "Thank you." Nathan tugged at her sleeve, holding up a slim volume with a faded red cover. "About the fox and the miller's daughter, can we?" She touched the worn spine. "Yes, I think we can." Victor was waiting when they returned. He didn't ask what had been said, just helped Nathan into the wagon and offered Penelope his hand. She took it without hesitation. They were halfway home when Nathan fell asleep against her side, mouth slightly open, book clutched to his chest. Penelope brushed a hand over his hair, then looked out across the rising hills. "You don't ask questions you already know the answers to," she said quietly. Victor's eyes stayed on the road. "No point in it. I was scared when you found me, not just because of what happened, but because I didn't know where I was going." He was silent a moment. "You know now, I think I'm starting to." The wagon creaked on. The cottonwoods along Fallen Creek rose in the distance, silver leaves flickering in the breeze. That evening, Penelope stood barefoot in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, flour dusting her knuckles. Victor came in through the doorway, pausing when he saw her setting dough into the iron pot. "You were supposed to rest. I wanted to do something that didn't need thinking." He crossed the room, set a small parcel on the table. "From the general store." She opened it slowly. Inside was a bolt of deep green calico, soft to the touch, not fancy, not plain, something in between. "For your sewing," he said. "Thought maybe you'd want to make something of your own." She looked at him, eyes shining but dry. "You always see what I need before I do." "I don't know about that. I do." Nathan came running in, arms full of firewood. "I brought enough for the whole night." Victor tousled his hair. "Good man." Penelope folded the fabric carefully and set it aside. Then she turned toward Victor, hands still dusted with flour. "I want to build something here. Not just get by. I've been waiting for someone to build it with." She stepped closer. "Then let's start." And when he kissed her this time, it wasn't the first slow promise of something coming. It was the beginning. Solid, certain, and already rooted in something deeper than either of them had expected. Outside, the fireflies began to rise. The wheatgrass had begun to yellow in the fields by late July, and the hills around Fallen Creek turned the color of old brass. The morning sun reached long across the porch, catching dust in the air as Penelope sat stitching at the table just inside the doorway, her needle slipping through muslin with slow, careful rhythm. Nathan played nearby with a small wooden cart Victor had carved from scrap pine, dragging it across the floorboards, whispering stories into its wheels. Victor's boots sounded on the back step, and he ducked through the doorway with a coil of fencing wire in one hand and a splintered post tucked under his arm. "I'll need to ride east tomorrow," he said, setting the post near the hearth. One of the heifers broke through the fence near the cotton flats, could be straying toward the river bend. Penelope didn't look up from her sewing. "How far is that?" 2 hours out, maybe more if she's wandered deep. She set her needle down and rested her hands in her lap. "I'll ride with you." Victor leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, studying her. "You've never ridden that far." "I didn't know how to bake bread 2 months ago either," she said, lifting her chin. "I'd like to learn." He didn't smile, but his eyes warmed. "Then you'll need a saddle of your own. Mine's too wide at the seat for you." She stood and brushed off her skirt. "What kind would you recommend?" Victor glanced at the light shifting across the floorboards. "There's an old McClellan in the barn loft. Narrow tree, lightweight. Needs new stirrup leathers, but it'll hold." Nathan looked up from the corner. "Can I come too?" Victor shook his head. "Not this time. You'll stay with Mrs. Wilkes. She'll have you helping in her garden if you ask polite." Nathan's face fell, but he didn't argue. After supper, Penelope followed Victor out to the barn. The loft ladder creaked under her hands, and the air smelled of hay and warm pine. He lifted the saddle down and set it on the ground between them. "Belonged to my mother," he said, brushing dust from the fender. "She'd ride fence same as any man. Folks didn't speak against it much. She had a way of silencing people just by standing still." Penelope ran her fingers along the worn leather. "I think I would have liked her." Victor knelt beside the saddle, testing the straps. "She would have liked you too." She didn't care for women who waited on men to speak first. Penelope squatted across from him. "Did you ever think you'd end up back here, on this land?" He worked the buckle with quiet precision. "Not until I saw you fall apart in that church. Then I knew I had to stay." She didn't reply, but her hand came to rest on the saddle horn, steady and sure. They left before sunup. Nathan stood beside Mrs. Wilkes's gate, clutching a tin pail of cornbread and a slingshot. Penelope kissed his forehead, murmuring something low and soft, then mounted up behind Victor without looking back. The ride eastward cut through scattered groves of alder and along creeks still muddy from spring's runoff. The silence between them was easy now, broken only by the creak of leather and the call of a hawk wheeling far above. By mid-morning, they found the heifer near a wind-warped cottonwood, grazing on wild clover. Victor dismounted, rope in hand, and moved slow and low across the slope. Penelope stayed mounted, knees braced, watching the line of his shoulders as he coaxed the animal back toward the trail. When he returned, leading the cow behind him, Penelope raised one brow. "You didn't even startle her." "She's just lost, not wild," he said, tying the rope to his saddle horn. "Sometimes all something needs is a way back." They rode in silence for a while after that, the cow trailing behind. The wind lifted Penelope's braid, and the air carried the scent of sage and creek water. At the bend above the ridge, she reined in. "This land, it's quiet." Victor turned in the saddle. "It's honest, doesn't give more than you earn, but it doesn't take more than you can carry either." She looked out over the valley, the sweep of gold and green below them. "I'd like to build something here. A schoolhouse, maybe. One room. For the children who don't have books." He nodded once. "I'll haul the lumber. You just say where." The wind shifted and a hawk's shadow passed over them. That night, they bedded the cow down in the far pen and walked back to the cabin by lantern light. Penelope's steps were slow from the ride, but she didn't complain. Inside, she poured water into the basin and washed the dust from her face and arms. Victor sat beside the fire, his expression unreadable. She came to stand beside him, drying her hands. "You've never asked what I wanted before all this. I figured if it mattered, you'd say. I thought I wanted a life without trouble, something quiet, predictable, but that wasn't living." He looked up at her then, eyes catching the firelight. "And now, I want to grow things. I want to teach. I want to raise Nathan where he can run free and never feel like he was left behind again." She eased down beside him, their shoulders touching. "And I want to do all of that with you." Victor didn't speak right away. Then he reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small silver ring, the kind that carried no stones, no flourish, just a plain band, worn smooth with time. "My father gave this to my mother when they were married," he said. "She wore it until the day she died. I kept it close, but I think it's time it had a home again." Penelope stared at it, breath caught in her throat. He took her hand gently and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had been made for her. "I never asked before," he said, voice low, "but I'm asking now. Will you be my wife, Penelope Dearing?" She closed her fingers around his. "Yes, Victor Fallen, I will." Outside, the wind rustled the tall grass, and in the quiet that followed, the land seemed to breathe with them. The morning Penelope and Victor were wed. The sky hung low with rain, soft and steady as breath. No church, no rows of benches, no crowd, just a cottonwood clearing near Fallen Creek, the roots slick with moss and the grass bent under the weight of water. Victor wore a clean shirt and the same coat he'd worn the day he found her. Penelope stood in a calico dress she'd sewn herself, green as prairie willow, the silver ring already warm on her finger. Mrs. Wilkes officiated, her voice quiet but sure. Nathan stood between them, holding a small bouquet of prairie roses he'd picked himself. When Victor said, "I do," his voice didn't shake. When Penelope answered, she didn't look away once. After, they didn't kiss in front of the others. They only held hands, and that was enough. Later, back at the cabin, Penelope pulled the quilt from the bed and shook it out in the yard to air while Victor chopped kindling near the smokehouse. Nathan helped gather the smaller branches, dragging them in a burlap sack. The rain had lifted, though the sky stayed gray and close. Victor paused, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Penelope folded the quilt over the line. "Not lately. I used to think I was meant to drift, never saw myself putting down anything permanent." She turned to him, her hands still. "And now," he glanced over at her, then at the small garden she'd started near the porch, rows of onion shoots just pushing through the soil. "Now I measure time by what grows." Nathan ran past them, chasing a gray chicken that had wandered from the pen. Victor set down the axe and caught the bird with one hand, handing it back with the other. Nathan grinned, then ran off again, boots kicking up mud. Penelope watched the boy disappear around the shed. "He started humming when he plays." "He never did that until last week." Victor leaned against the chopping block, quieter now. "He's beginning to believe we'll stay." She joined him, arms crossed. "I think I am too." That evening, Victor brought in a cedar chest from the barn loft, one he'd found tucked behind sacks of old grain. It had belonged to his mother, the hinges rusted and the top etched with initials worn nearly smooth. "I thought you might keep your sewing in it," he said, setting it near the hearth. Penelope knelt to lift the lid. Inside were spools of thread, a few faded ribbons, and a child's dress folded with care. She touched the fabric, then closed the lid gently. "She must have loved someone very much." "She lost a daughter before me," Victor said, voice even. I didn't know about it until I was grown." Penelope looked up at him, her hand resting on the cedar grain. "I'm sorry." She never talked about it, but she kept that little dress like it was waiting on someone. Penelope ran her thumb along the edge of the box. "Maybe it was." Victor crouched beside her. "I don't want to keep things quiet anymore, not the ones that matter." "I don't either." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "We're not drifting anymore, Pen." She closed her eyes. "No. We're rooted." The fire crackled behind them, throwing light across the room. Outside, the wind picked up, but it didn't rattle the windows like it used to. Not tonight. Later, after Nathan had fallen asleep with his book open across his chest, Penelope stepped onto the porch. Victor joined her, a blanket draped over his shoulders. "I found something else in the barn," he said, "up near the rafters." She looked at him, curious. A cradle, carved by hand. "Looks like it's never been used." Penelope's breath caught, not from surprise, but from something quieter. Hope. She reached for his hand, and he didn't ask anything else. They stood together, watching the stars come out one by one, the land around them breathing slow and steady, like a heart finally at rest. The first frost came early that year, brittle along the edges of the creek and white in the hollows before dawn. Penelope wrapped Nathan in a thick wool coat before walking him to the schoolhouse, her boots crunching over stiff grass. The building stood alone near the cottonwoods, a single stovepipe smoking against the pale sky. She unlocked the door and let them in, setting her books near the stove and laying kindling in the firebox. Victor had built the benches by hand-wide planks, smooth at the edges, space to fit children of all shapes. Nathan helped straighten the slates, stacking them neatly while Penelope lit the fire. The warmth crept slowly outward. She placed a jar of dried wildflowers near the window, a small brightness against the gray. She looked around the room. "They'll come." Nathan kicked his legs beneath the bench. "Even the ones who don't know how to read yet, especially them." By mid-morning, 4 children arrived, escorted by tired mothers and one older brother with a hitch in his step. They sat with quiet hands and wide eyes, glancing at one another, unsure. Penelope greeted each by name, never raising her voice, setting slates before them with chalk already trimmed. She began with letters drawn slow and careful on the board, her voice calm. The children followed, hesitating at first, then more confident. Nathan whispered encouragement, pointing to his own lines and nodding when others looked unsure. Outside, Victor stacked firewood near the cabin, pausing now and then to glance toward the schoolhouse. When Penelope stepped out at midday, her shawl pulled tight, he met her halfway between buildings. "They're learning," she told him without preamble. "I figured they would. You've got a way of making things seem possible." She studied him in the cold light. "Do you ever wonder what your parents would think of this?" He looked toward the land, the low hills beyond the cottonwoods. "I think they'd be surprised I stayed, but they'd understand why." Penelope reached for his hand, gloved and rough. "I never thought I'd belong to anything again." "You don't just belong," he said. "You've built something." Snow fell a week later, soft and steady, laying a hush over everything. The creek froze near the banks, and Victor hung lanterns along the porch eaves to guide the path from schoolhouse to cabin. At night, Penelope read aloud while Nathan carved figures from leftover kindling, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. On the first clear night after the storm, Victor led her outside, a blanket wrapped around both their shoulders. The stars were sharp overhead, the snow glowing faintly in the moonlight. He stopped near the garden beds, now covered for winter, and turned to her. "Come spring, I want to add another room to the cabin, one with a proper desk for you and space enough for more books." Penelope leaned against him. "You're planning ahead. I'm thinking ahead." She rested her head on his chest. "Then think about this, I missed a month. He went still. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I've counted twice." Victor's hands trembled against her waist before he gathered her close again. "You sure?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't. You want this?" "Yes, with you and Nathan and the land, all of it." His breath warmed her hair. "I'll build a cradle." "You already found one." He laughed, low and unsteady, and kissed her beneath the stars. Their boots shifting in the snow. By early March, the thaw had begun. The creek ran louder and birds returned to the trees near the cabin. The schoolhouse filled slowly, 9 children now, some traveling from homesteads miles away. Penelope taught each with the same quiet patience, her growing belly hidden beneath wool shawls and thick aprons. She moved slower, but her voice stayed strong, her hands steady. Nathan grew taller, his reading sharper. He still carved, leaving little animals on the porch rail for her to find: rabbits, foxes, even a clumsy horse with uneven legs. Victor added shelves to the cabin walls, filled them with books and jars of dried herbs Penelope had gathered the summer before. One morning she bent over to adjust a student's slate and winced, pressing a hand to her side. The boy looked up, wide-eyed. "Go fetch Mr. Fallen," she said, voice even. "Now." Victor arrived at her run, coat half-buttoned, face pale. She met him at the door. "It's time." The birth was long but not hard. Mrs. Wilkes came, quiet and capable, and Nathan waited outside, sitting on the porch steps with his carved animals lined up beside him. Victor never left Penelope's side, holding her hand through each wave, his voice low and steady. Their daughter came just after sunset, small, dark-haired, wrapped in a quilt that had been folded at the foot of the bed for weeks. Penelope held her close, counting each finger, tracing the curve of her nose. Victor sat beside her, one hand on their daughter's back. "She's strong. She's home," Penelope whispered. Nathan crept in, barefoot, eyes wide. "Can I hold her?" Penelope shifted, motioning him close. "Sit gentle." He settled beside her, cradling the baby with both arms. "She's warm." "She's your sister now," Victor said. Nathan looked up. "I know." The cabin filled with soft sounds, the crackle of fire, the sigh of wind through chinked walls, the rustle of quilts. Penelope leaned into Victor's side, the baby sleeping against her chest, Nathan curled at her knee. They sat that way for a long while, no one speaking, everything finally whole. Years passed, and the land changed with the seasons. The schoolhouse doubled in size, with children coming as far as 20 miles, some on horseback, others walking in pairs. Penelope taught them all, her daughter's first one. Then another 2 years later, playing at the edge of the room until they were old enough to learn their letters. Victor's hands grew stiff in the winters, but he worked slowly now, methodical, never rushed. He taught Nathan to mend fences, to read the sky for storms, to be the kind of man who waited before speaking. The cabin grew too, room by room, each added with care. No part built in haste, no corner left unused. They never left the land. They had no reason to. At night, when the girls were asleep and Nathan sat reading by the hearth, Penelope would rest her feet in Victor's lap, her eyes half closed, a book forgotten in her hand. "You ever regret it?" he asked once, long after the snow had come again. She looked at him, the firelight soft on her face. Not one breath of it. They stayed that way as the fire burned low, the wind brushing the windows, the house holding strong around them. And so they lived day by day, season by season, bound not by what they'd lost, but by every quiet, steady thing they had built together.